Hi, this is Lynn Drake with Compass Commercial, and today my guest is Dan Cassidy. Dan Cassidy works at SME. He's actually a principal at SME, and his responsibilities include setting and implementing the environmental group's business strategy, setting and executing the group's operational plan, providing senior technical leadership, and managing liability issues. He also works on brownfield redevelopment strategies and financing environmental regulatory compliance. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in environmental geoscience from Michigan State University, graduating with honors, and he is an MBA from Wayne State University in Detroit, where he is also a candidate for his Juris Doctorate. Wow, that's quite impressive. Hi, Dan. How are you doing today?
Hey, good morning, Lynn. Doing well, thank you.
Great. Okay, so we're going to be talking about environmental laws when people are purchasing or leasing buildings today. I think a lot of people don't always take them as seriously as they need to, and that's why I've asked Dan to come today to fill us in. So Dan, can you start with the basics with us? What is an environmental due diligence?
Sure, yeah, it's a really good place to start, because I think there's a lot of confusion over what it is and why we do it or why we recommend it. So in generalities, environmental due diligence is it's an assessment of a piece of real estate, can or cannot include a building, but it's designed to uncover the environmental and health risks before someone acquires or leases a piece of real estate, commercial, industrial, residential.
Mm-hmm.
We really do it or recommend it because it helps those prospective buyers and tenants understand the environmental risks associated with owning or leasing that piece of real estate. So it really helps them make an informed investment decision before they buy or lease. So I recommend it for all situations, all types of real estate, from farm fields to industrial factories. Certainly recommend it for what they call brownfield sites or an obviously contaminated property. I certainly would do it there, but it really provides value for almost any situation.
Can you define brownfield for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. A brownfield is defined differently in every state, believe it or not, because there's different laws in place. In Michigan, where we're currently sitting, it involves, it's primarily contaminated property in some way, but can also be impaired by its functional obsolescence if it's no longer you're no longer able to use it in its originally intended purpose. It could also be a blighted property, so it's an abandoned factory or abandoned residential building that is no longer safe to use. So kind of covers the whole gambit.
Thank you. Okay, so if you needed to do phase 1 and or phase 2, how long does that take?
Phase 1's typically 3 to 4 weeks. I'd say most consultants out there are doing them, on average in 4 weeks. The timeline, I get asked often, well, can you do it faster? And yeah, sometimes we can. The caveat is, it's not working harder or having my people, burn the midnight oil always, because we're relying on information and data coming in from a lot of different sources. One of those being the local units of government, and there's records that we want to review at the city or the county or the state, and we're relying upon our Freedom of Information Request Act or Freedom of Information Act request, and those have their own kind of guidelines of when they can fulfill our request. And some communities are very responsive and we get in and get those records quickly. Others, especially the larger cities that have very large volumes of records, those take longer to fulfill, and they usually run through their legal department. So that's typically why it can take longer, but we could certainly move faster if those records are available in a timely manner.
Just talking about the city records, this is June of 2020, and COVID has kind of closed a lot of things down. Did that affect you guys with getting city records?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, hopefully this is temporary, but absolutely. The A lot of the municipalities are still closed or shuttered or have their employees working from home. And so when we submit these requests, we'll often get a response that, hey, we're not in the office, or we're unable to access our records currently. We'll either be delayed in getting a response to you, or we're unable to respond to your request, which is perfectly reasonable. We're in,
Right.
unusual times. And so when we're doing our reporting on it, if we're unable to get the record, we're going to go ahead and proceed with the evaluation, but we'll just note it as a limitation.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a strange time, to say the least. So what kind of cost would somebody expect for environmental phase one or phase two?
Yeah, so from a phase one perspective, the pricing can vary somewhat, but they're all within a range of, call it, $2,000 to $4,000, I'd say. The difference in cost can vary by, company that you retain, and that price is usually dictated by the experience or the quality of the firm. But the price can also vary by the nature of the real estate itself. So if it's a 1 acre farm field, it's probably going to be a lower price than if
Right.
it's a 20 acre factory.
Right. Okay. Um, why would a prospective tenant or buyer conduct an environmental due diligence?
Well, there's a lot of reasons to do it. It's not a requirement of any law, but there are laws in place that you know um, establish the liability protections that can be afforded by doing like a phase one environmental site assessment. But if you're acquiring real estate or going to be leasing and you have a lender involved, those are entities that can require it as a function of their lending.
Mm-hmm.
So for the most part, the lenders are going to drive the process. If you don't have a lender involved and essentially don't have anybody forcing you to do it, it's still really wise to conduct your environmental due diligence. I kind of associate it or think it's akin to conducting a home inspection. If you're just buying a single family home,
Mm-hmm.
we all want to know what we're getting before we buy it. And when you're buying commercial or industrial real estate, the 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 price is higher and the risks are higher. So why wouldn't you do the same thing or more? And so your environmental due diligence prior to purchase or prior to leasing can be really important to try to uncover those environmental issues or those health risks before you even begin your negotiation. That's the other thing I think people forget.
Yes.
Um, if the property is impaired, you want to know that because the price is typically set based on the market conditions, and theoretically it's environmental condition or it's the condition of the building. And so I would want to know that certainly before I'm beginning a negotiation with the seller. And just one little comment there too. We're primarily talking about environmental due diligence here in this discussion, but I will make a plug for some other items to consider that aren't necessarily environmentally related. If there's a building or a structure on the property or the piece of real estate you're acquiring, we also typically recommend doing a building condition assessment or a property condition assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Those types of evaluations can reveal some fairly expensive problems if you don't look prior. For example, your roof system, if that's failing, or if it's a 20-year roof that was put in 19.9 years ago, you might want to know about it before you buy it, because those can be very expensive items. And if you bought the property and you hadn't negotiated that prior, surprise, you got a big problem on your hands. Those condition assessments also look at building envelope issues. They can look at your HVAC systems and other kind of key systems of a building.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third area, that if you're going to put an addition on your building or if you're going to build on the property, we also recommend geotechnical evaluations to look at the soil conditions, the constructability of the property itself. I'm fortunate to work at SME where we have professionals and experts in all of those areas. So it's really fun for me when I'm dealing with a prospective buyer or tenant to talk about all these issues and offer all within one roof, if you will, these services. And we all work very closely together when we're looking at these properties. So our recommendations are often kind of linked together, because if you're replacing a roof system, especially the older ones, can have asbestos in it. So our environmental professionals work with our roofing specialists. If you're going to be rebuilding or redeveloping a property, and you want to understand the constructability, well, if you're going to have to dig a basement and put in some sort of significant foundation system, you kind of need to know the environmental condition of the property. If you're going to be removing soils, or you're going to have construction workers and laborers working in that soil, they need to understand the risks associated with handling that soil, working in the soil, any potential exposure. So our construction and geotechnical professionals and our building envelope professionals all work very closely with our environmental professionals.
Great. Let me just share with you one thing. I spent, most people don't realize this, in the 80s, I leased truck terminals and warehouses across the United States. And one of the things when you're renting, if you could talk about this, if you're renting a truck terminal and there's an underground tank and you don't get it tested, and then there's contamination, could that hurt them later on? They didn't test it?
Yeah, potentially. So when you going back to environmental due diligence for a second, the phase 1 environmental site assessment, if it's conducted, according to, there's an ASTM standard out there. It's currently, what are we in 2020 here? There's a 2013 standard out there that everybody follows. They're talking about updating it next year. If you follow that standard and conduct your all appropriate inquiry by definition, according to the statute, you are afforded a liability protection through that statute. So if you've done your phase 1 and you've essentially, if you conduct all appropriate inquiry and you find no issues and you buy a property, you're protected, even if later information comes out that there is some impairment, like an underground storage tank. It can happen. Not all records are readily ascertainable or available when you conduct a phase 1. Mm-hmm. And even when we look and we have suspicion of an underground storage tank, they still can be missed. The next stage is a phase 2 environmental assessment after you do a phase 1, which we can talk about in a minute. So it can happen. However, if you don't do a phase 1, you buy a property and then you find a tank, yes, you could be. This is legal realm here, and I'm not an attorney. So I would recommend anybody seek legal counsel if you have not conducted your all appropriate inquiry before you purchased or leased, and then you find some impairment like an underground storage tank, because that can get tricky and you could be in for a lot of costs and liability.
What are the most common issues that you identify in a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which you guys are referring to as ESA, environmental site assessment?
Correct. Frequently, it's the old corner gas station or service garage. Man, we just about, at least in the urban areas, and sometimes in suburban, well, certainly in suburban and urban, but even in rural areas, you can find those corner gas stations. I'd say that's probably the most common if I sat and did the statistics on it, because they were everywhere back in the day. Dry cleaners are also pretty prevalent. And were common back in the day, and you can even find those mixed into residential neighborhoods. They converted their house into a dry cleaner. One of the things we're seeing often in urban areas is it's currently a vacant lot, but it's in between, a lot of development, and it's in the middle of your downtown. Odds are it was developed previously. It's just, they demolished a building. Well, many of the buildings might have had basements, and those basements may have been backfilled. So urban fill and buried basements is a pretty common issue that people don't think about. And then another one that's pretty common in residential areas, certain residential areas is heating oil tanks. A lot of the homes back in, prior to natural gas, the prevalence of natural gas were heated with coal and other heats, fueling sources, but heating oil tanks was one of them. That's why it's so important to talk to your local government, your fire departments, and health inspectors in the local communities. They typically know the history of the community and if there were heating oils common, and so we'll take a look and see if those are there. So those are some of the more common items we run into.
Great. What are the limitations of a phase one ESA?
It's kind of what I mentioned when we were talking about the underground storage tanks. The phase one's only as good as the information available at the time, and the ASTM standard requires certain level of investigation. But if the records aren't available or don't exist at the time of the assessment, the assessment's only going to reveal what's available at the time. And so it especially right now with there's a prevalence of digitizing historical records at a lot of the communities, which makes sense. Everybody's trying to get rid of paper. We found instances even recently where the community was in the process of digitizing, so they didn't make available to us all of the records. So they were out for digitization, or they were buried somewhere in some back room. And it was later, revealed that there were records existing of an underground storage tank. And, why was it missed when you guys did the phase one 10 years ago? Well, the records weren't available to us. We can ask and
Right.
FOIA, if you will, but if they don't provide it, we're not going to know it. So that's certainly a limitation. The other thing that's pretty common is access into portions of a building. So when we want to do a review of a building at that stage, we ask for access to every nook and cranny, every room, every locked door.
Mm-hmm.
There, it can exist where someone doesn't have the key to that one door, or they don't want us accessing a certain portion of the building. If, for example, if there's other tenants mixed in and they don't want to have somebody walking through their space. If it's an active, manufacturing facility, there could be, health or safety reasons we can't access a certain area. And then, especially in some of the urban areas with some of the, more challenged buildings, they might be unsafe to enter. We found where the whole second floor is rotted out, so you can't access it, or the basement's flooded. Those are things that happen out there. So those are certainly big limitations.
I remember visiting truck terminals in the 80s and finding people living in them too.
Yeah.
It was a little scary because I was generally by myself with my mace.
Yeah, we typically will hire security to come with us if we have that suspicion, and it's not uncommon in urban areas. You just got to be very vocal when you walk in there and make sure they know you're coming. They typically get out of your way.
I was chased. I don't know. Asbestos surveys. Can you talk about that?
Sure. One misconception is that an asbestos survey is a part of a phase one environmental site assessment. It's not, according to the standard. However, it's not uncommon to do an asbestos survey at the same time as a phase one environmental site assessment. So a phase one site assessment is really it's a review of available information. It's a site recon. It's a review of historical records. It's interviews of owners and community members. A phase two is you're actually taking samples at the site. You're further evaluating the concerns you identify in a phase one. An asbestos assessment is kind of like that. It's almost like a phase two. Sometimes it's even lumped into the scope of a phase two, where you have suspicion of asbestos containing building materials, and anybody who's a licensed asbestos inspector knows by at least visual observation what building materials might be, suspicious for asbestos.
Mm-hmm.
And age isn't always the qualifying factor. Another misconception, as a side note, new buildings can have asbestos containing materials. It's not illegal to have building materials contain asbestos. Another misconception. And our neighbors to the, typically we say neighbors to the north, but in Detroit we say to the south also, but Canada.
Canada.
It's, that's a lot of the major sources of asbestos come from Canada, where it's a big industry. It's mined. It's a naturally occurring mineral that's mined, and so it's quite common, and so not a big surprise, especially here in Michigan, to have asbestos and building materials still coming across the border. But regardless, asbestos assessments typically are taking samples of those building materials that are suspicious to contain asbestos. When you grab those samples, we submit them to a laboratory for analysis to determine if there's asbestos fibers, which is that mineral that is contained in those building components, and then what's the percentage of those fibers amongst the matrix of that material. And if there's asbestos, now some of the state laws kick in, and your health and safety procedures, as far as if you're going to be renovating a building or you're going to be demolishing a building, there's OSHA and some of the other state laws and federal laws require that material often to be abated or removed from the structure prior to renovation, certainly demolition. So that's kind of why people want to know that, again, prior to acquisition or leasing. They want to know if there's asbestos containing materials in that structure. So one, they can either negotiate a price to deal with it, or certainly just be aware that it's present so they can protect their employees or occupants of the building, either through abatement or some other operational management kind of procedure. So in other words, encapsulation, or don't touch that wall, it's got asbestos in it, so we're going to not impact that material.
How is the scope of these environmental due diligence methods determined?
Well, a phase one, the scope is really set by the standard, and I think I've addressed that. Pretty much all phase ones have the same scope. The quality and the kind of level of expertise can vary widely, to be honest, by the consultant performing them, and that's usually based on the experience of the environmental professional conducting the phase one. Of phase two, when you get to that stage, the scope can vary quite a lot. At SME, it's primary. Let me say this before I say what SME does. For the most part, the scope of a phase two is designed to further evaluate the concerns identified in the phase one, generally speaking. However, that scope can be tailored a fair amount depending on the kind of the unique objectives of the particular project. We also take into consideration the risk tolerances of our client, or the prospective buyer or tenant. So we always feel it's really important to customize our phase twos and the scope of those to our clients' needs.
Mm-hmm.
We're consultants, we're advisors, so we're gonna provide our clients with the knowledge and arm them and educate them and provide options for what we think could be done to deal with the issues. And we really want to make sure the client's involved in that process so they get what they want, and as much as they want, and as little as they want in some situations. And some situations require less intrusive investigation than others if there's lower risks or our client has a higher risk tolerance. Other situations require a lot more investigation and a lot larger scope if there's bigger concerns, if it's like a factory or one of these brownfield sites we talked about, or an old gas station. Certainly dry cleaners, which I mentioned earlier. Or the other thing that's really important when you're looking at the scope of kind of the next stage is is we're always asking, well, what's the intended use? What's your plans for the property? Um, if it's going to be a daycare for children, our recommendations might be different than if it's going to be a factory with heavy chemical use. The other thing we stress when we talk about a phase two, first of all, you only really need to do a phase two ESA if there's environmental issues identified in the phase one.
Mhm.
And we certainly do a lot of phase ones that have no issues identified. But the first thing we say when we, if we do a phase one and we find issues, we say, okay, guys, don't run away. Let's talk about what's going on, because that's the impulse. People go,
Yeah.
oh God, here we go. You found some problems, and now I'm upset because I really wanted this property, or the seller's upset because now they feel like there's issues and their deal's going to fall apart. Our job is to really facilitate deals, make sure they go through. As advisors, we're going to, let all the parties understand what are the issues, what are the risks, and what can we do about it. And there's a whole variety of things that can be done to address these issues. In most states we work in have laws in place that allow for acquisition of real estate or leasing of real estate, and to obtain liability protections.
And then what about the lender requirements? How does that affect what you have to do?
Yeah, they can certainly influence the scope. Some of the larger national banks have environmental departments, and so if you're getting a loan through a commercial bank, doesn't even have to be a large commercial bank, but they tend to have the more restrictions or requirements, and they could help dictate the scope. Some have they want their risk tolerance is a lot lower typically. They want to know all the impairments before they make a loan, because it impacts the ability of their customer to repay the loan if there's a big problem. So they can influence. Some of the government agencies can influence the scope. Lenders like the Small Business Association or HUD, they typically are very conservative, and we even put language in our proposals that if you're seeking finance through the SBA or HUD, for example, or MISHDA here in Michigan, which is basically HUD, we want to know that up front, because it will influence the scope of these investigations or these assessments.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, that's good to know. What happens if a contamination is confirmed in a phase two?
Yeah, again, I would say don't run away. It's a common response, and people get scared, which I get. It's not fun to find out these properties have issues. We try to talk about some of those. We try to prepare our clients up front, especially if they, like former gas stations have a unique look to them, right? They're typically on corners.
Yeah.
Sometimes you see even in the pavement the remnants of the dispenser islands, or you can look at the building itself and boy, that sure looks like it was an old gas station. So we'll warn our clients up front, like, hey, this sure looks like it could be a gas station. Just beware, we're going to probably find issues, and here's generally what you typically find. But more typically, we don't know what we're getting into when we start these assessments. And if we've done a phase one, we recommended a phase two, we get out there based on the client's needs, and we do a phase two, and we find contamination in soil, groundwater, or the newer thing in around the country is soil vapors. So these are this is like this is gasification or volatilization of these chemicals present in the subsurface that can be released and then enter into buildings typically and enclosed spaces. So we look at all three of those media typically. Again, we're going to customize it based on the property, the client needs, the issues, etc. But if we do find those contaminants, now we're going to talk about what do you do about it. So the good news for buyers in most states is there are liability protections available through state laws. Michigan's always had, not always, but since the mid 1990s, Michigan's had this is back in the Governor Engler days, Michigan passed state laws that afforded prospective buyers of brownfield properties in Michigan with liability protection. So it's been a great program. Really has helped allow for a lot of transactions of kind of impaired properties in Michigan. Just I think in the last week or two, I was reading an update on Ohio, and the governor just signed their legislation that essentially passes similar language for the state of Ohio. It's not quite the same process that Michigan has, but it affords buyers of impaired property in Ohio with some liability protection. So it's really, the whole idea is to, kind of support brownfield redevelopment and purchasing of brownfield real estate or impaired real estate, which is, that's a good practice from any, perspective. But if you think about the best real estate, or a lot of the good real estate has already been developed. It's often in the urban areas, and that's where people want to be. But they were previously developed, and so you can find these impairments or these contaminants. So anyway, so that's one important aspect to think about, is there are liability protections available. So that's why I don't run away. The other important thing to consider is you want to understand what those issues are. So you want to have conducted enough evaluation to get a good handle on those issues prior to purchase. So you can, again, negotiate with the seller on price or other issues. Lenders are going to want to know this anyways. There's also the ability to sometimes get environmental insurance. And then the other thing that you really want to understand is, what's it going to mean for your use of the property? So if you're simply buying a building, property with a building on it, and you're going to, use it for the same purpose, but there's contaminants under the building that could be volatilizing into that space, well, you're certainly going to want to know that so you can protect your employees or your occupants. And there's laws in place that require that. In Michigan, if you're the non-liable owner, so you've done your phase one, you've done a phase two, you've conducted what they call a baseline environmental assessment in Michigan, and you submitted the paperwork to the state, the BEA report that affords you that liability protection. That doesn't completely get you off the hook. You still have the obligation to protect occupants of that building. They're called due care. In Michigan, we call it due care. It's really safe use obligations. And so, for example, with that example of the contaminants volatilizing into the breathing space of the building, you might have to install a vapor mitigation system below your slab of your building or inside your building to evacuate those vapors before they enter the breathing space. So you're basically protecting, those occupants from having to breathe those potentially harmful vapors. So anyway, so those are all things that once you find contamination, you're going to have to kind of think through all these steps. What's the best course of action to, meet the requirements of state law, meet the lender requirements, meet your own risk requirements, and protect the health and safety of, future users. It can get even more complicated if you're going to be constructing on the property. So we talked about earlier, kind of the combo of the SME typically gets involved with our geotechnical engineers. If there's a redevelopment occurring where they're going to actually build on the property or add to an existing building, you certainly want to understand the extent of the contamination, the type of contaminants, so you can manage it during construction, you can protect construction workers, and you can understand the costs before you get into it, because it can be significant. And then the final piece I'll add is in many of the states we operate, there are financial incentives available to pay for a lot of these things. So the earlier you can identify the issues or start thinking about it, the quicker you can talk to the state and local agencies that have financial incentives available to pay for redeveloping brownfields. And we have experts on staff at SME that can help our clients kind of work through that process. It can be complicated. It's not always difficult, but you really need to know the questions to ask. You need to have the appropriate information available. And then you understand, kind of the basics of real estate financing to link up those incentives with, lender requirements and other items.
Wow, that was amazing.
Sorry, a lot to talk about there.
There is a lot to talk about. And I think that's really the point, because I often find with my clients, they really don't think that they don't want to spend the money to do the phase one and the phase two. And it puts you at such risk. I could never understand it, but that's their decisions. I try to influence them to move forward with those things, because I just think it's too scary to not do that.
Yeah, like I said in the beginning, I'm sometimes befuddled too. My job is to be an advisor to
Right.
people, and I can give them my opinion and provide that and
Yeah.
give them options for, but I can't make people do, things, and they got to make their own decisions. And I respect that. I think there's a lot of different rationale for, purchasing real estate and wanting to understand, its condition before purchase. Me personally, if I'm making a big investment, I want to protect my investment. I want to know as much as I can up front. And to me, the math is typically works out pretty easily. If I'm going to spend a few $1,000s, potentially save tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, like, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah.
But, like I said, people have their own reasons, and we can only offer our opinion.
It's exactly what I do. I give my opinion, and then it's up to them. Well, Dan, I really appreciate your time today. You shared so many important things. And just as a reminder to our audience, Dan is with SME. They're out of Michigan, but you guys work across the United States. Is that correct?
We do, even internationally. Most of our
Okay, I didn't know
practice
that.
is in the Midwest here, though. All of our offices are located in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan.
Okay,
But we do work nationally and internationally.
great. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for the time. It's fun.